The words hit me like a sledgehammer to the chest. I married you out of pity, Nathan. You were pathetic back then, and honestly, not much has changed. My wife Victoria stood in our living room, arms crossed, her mother Diane smirking from the leather armchair in the corner. I gripped the edge of the kitchen counter, knuckles white, fighting every instinct to explode. 15 years of marriage, and this was how she truly felt. The room spun slightly as I processed cruelty in her voice. Diane's smirk widened, clearly enjoying my humiliation. They had rehearsed this moment. I realized this wasn't a slip of the tongue during an argument. This was calculated. My mind raced through 1,000 responses, 1,000 ways to defend myself. But something stopped me. Instead of rage, a cold clarity settled over me. I wouldn't give them the satisfaction of seeing me break. Not yet. Not until I understood exactly what I was dealing with. I straightened my shoulders, looked directly at Victoria, and said nothing. The silence unnerved her more than any outburst could have. I turned and walked to my study, closing the door softly behind me. The real fight was just beginning. My name is Nathan Pierce. I'm 38 years old, originally from Columbus, Ohio, and if you're enjoying the story of how I reclaimed my dignity, please subscribe to this channel for more fascinating stories like this. Trust me, what comes next will blow your mind. I sat alone in my study that night, unable to sleep. Every memory from the past 15 years replayed in my mind with brutal clarity. The family dinners where Diane would interrupt me mid-sentence to correct something I'd said. The business decisions Victoria made without consulting me, then claiming I wouldn't understand anyway. The passive-aggressive comment about my job as a high school mathematics teacher, as if educating children was somehow beneath her family standards. I remembered our wedding day. I thought Victoria's tears were from happiness. Now, I wondered if they were from settling. Her family owned a chain of successful medical supply companies across 3 states. My parents had been middle-class workers who taught me the value of honesty and hard work. Apparently, that wasn't enough. I pulled out a notebook and began writing. Every insult, every dismissal, every moment I'd been made to feel small. The pattern was undeniable. But anger wouldn't help me now. I needed strategy. I needed proof. And most importantly, I needed patience. The next morning, I made a call to Bernard Fitzgerald, an accountant whose name I'd gotten from a colleague at school. Bernard had a reputation for thoroughness and discretion. I need a comprehensive financial review, I told him over the phone, keeping my voice steady. My wife's family business has some complicated holdings, and I want to make sure everything's in order for estate planning purposes. It wasn't entirely a lie. Bernard agreed to meet me at his office downtown the following Tuesday. I hung up and returned to the breakfast table, where Victoria and Diane were discussing a shopping trip to Atlanta. Neither acknowledged my presence. Diane was staying with us for what she called an extended visit, which really meant she was supervising her daughter's marriage and finding it lacking. I watched them, these 2 women who thought they had me figured out, and I felt something shift inside me. They had no idea what was coming. I smiled into my coffee cup, let them think they'd won. Bernard's office was modest but organized, which gave me confidence. He was a man in his late 50s with steel gray hair and sharp eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. I provided him with access to our joint accounts and the business documents Victoria kept in her home office. Just routine checks, I explained. My wife handles most of the financial planning, but I want to make sure I understand everything. Bernard nodded professionally, asking technical questions about various accounts and holdings. Over the next week, he began his review while I maintained my normal routine at school. Teaching algebra to 9th graders had never felt more therapeutic. At home, Victoria and Diane continued their superiority routine. At dinner, Diane made a pointed comment about my simple taste when I mentioned enjoying a documentary about the space program. Victoria laughed, touching her mother's arm conspiratorially. I cut my steak and said nothing. Bernard called me 3 days later. I've found some minor discrepancies, he said carefully. Nothing major yet, but some transactions that don't quite add up. My pulse quickened, but I kept my voice calm. Continue the review, please. Be thorough. Diane's arrogance reached new heights that weekend. We sat at dinner, takeout from an expensive Italian restaurant because neither Victoria nor her mother cooked, and Diane launched into a speech about her superior judgment in business and life. "You see, Nathan, some people are born with instincts for success," she said, gesturing with her wine glass. "Others have to be guided. There's no shame in recognizing your limitations." Victoria nodded along, not even pretending to offend me anymore. I chewed my pasta slowly, letting her words wash over me without reaction. My calm seemed to frustrate Diane. She wanted a response, wanted to provoke me into defending myself so she could dismiss me further. Instead, I smiled slightly and said, "You're probably right, Diane. I've always appreciated Victoria's family's business acumen." The answer confused her. She frowned, searching for the insult in my agreement. After dinner, I noticed something. Diane had left her leather portfolio on the side table, unzipped. Inside, I could see file folders with the medical supply company's logo. She'd grown careless in her contempt for me. That night, after everyone went to bed, I made my move. The portfolio contained more than I'd hoped for. Bank statements from accounts I'd never heard of. Correspondence about loans that weren't reflected in the business documents Victoria had shown me. A folder labeled Restructuring 2019 that detailed debt I didn't know existed. My hands trembled as I photographed each page of my phone, careful to return everything exactly as I'd found it. The medical supply business that Diane ran with such supposed brilliance was hemorrhaging money. The flagship store in Birmingham had defaulted on its lease. 2 locations in Tennessee faced lawsuits from suppliers. Most damning of all, there were personal loans Diane had taken against company assets, signed with Victoria's authorization. My wife had been gambling our financial future on her mother's mismanagement, and neither of them had bothered to tell me. I spent 2 hours that night in my study, organizing the photographs into folders on my encrypted laptop. The pieces were beginning to fit together. Diane's extended stay wasn't just about supervising Victoria's marriage. She was hiding from her failing business, using our home as a refuge while her empire crumbled. And Victoria, desperate for her mother's approval, had enabled every disaster. I began planting seeds of doubt with surgical precision. At breakfast, I mentioned casually, I saw an article about medical supply companies struggling with insurance changes. How's the Birmingham location handling that? Victoria looked up from her phone, startled. It's fine. Mother handles everything. Of course, I said, buttering my toast. I just wondered because the article mentioned inventory issues causing cash flow problems. But I'm sure Diane's on top of it. I watched Victoria's expression. A tiny furrow appeared between her eyebrows. What article? Oh, just something in the business section. Probably doesn't apply to your family's operation. They're much more established. Later that day, I overheard Victoria on the phone with her mother, asking pointed questions about Birmingham inventory. Diane's voice rose defensively through the phone speaker. "Why are you suddenly questioning my management? Has Nathan been filling your head with nonsense?" "No, Mother. I just want to understand. You don't need to understand. That's what I'm here for." But the seed was planted. Victoria's absolute faith in her mother's perfection had its first tiny crack. I continued teaching my students about equations and proofs, all while executing a much more personal problem-solving exercise at home. Bernard called again, his voice tight with professional concern. "Nathan, I need to show you what I found. Can you come to my office tomorrow?" I met him during my lunch period, telling the school I had a dentist appointment. Bernard spread documents across his conference table, like a prosecutor presenting evidence. "The family business is insolvent," he said bluntly. "They've been moving debt between subsidiary accounts to hide the losses. The Birmingham location alone is $2 million underwater. There are 3 outstanding lawsuits and 2 federal tax liens." I sat down heavily, though I'd suspected something like this. Seeing the numbers in black and white was different. And my wife, her name is on multiple loan guarantees. If the business goes under, creditors can pursue your joint assets. Bernard pushed his glasses up. "Did you know about any of this?" "No, I said honestly. I was married out of pity, apparently. Financial transparency wasn't part of the arrangement. Bernard's expression flickered with sympathy, but he remained professional. I'm documenting everything. You need to protect yourself legally. That night, I backed up every file to 3 separate encrypted drives. I had the evidence. Now I needed the perfect timing. Victoria noticed a change in me, though she couldn't identify what had shifted. I was calmer, more focused, almost cheerful. It unsettled her. "You're acting strange," she said one evening as I prepared dinner. Something I'd started doing instead of ordering takeout. "Strange how?" I asked, dicing vegetables with practiced precision. "I don't know. Different. Are you planning something?" I looked at her directly. "I'm planning to make us a nice meal. Is that suspicious?" She studied me, searching for deception, but I'd learned from the best. 15 years of watching her and Diane manipulate situations had taught me how to mask my intentions. "Nathan, if there's something you want to discuss." "There is, actually," I interrupted. "I've been thinking we should have a family financial planning meeting. Make sure everything's organized. You know, for the future." Victoria's eyes widened slightly. "That's not necessary. Mother handles everything." "I know, but I'd like to understand our position better. As your husband, I think I should be informed, don't you?" The request was reasonable, which made it impossible for her to refuse without raising more questions. She agreed reluctantly, saying she'd talk to Diane. I smiled and returned to cooking, knowing I'd just set the trap. The opening came during another dinner conversation. Diane, emboldened by wine, was explaining why she made certain business decisions without burdening Victoria with details. "Sometimes," Diane said, her words slightly slurred, "a mother knows what's best for her daughter." I protected her from complications that she didn't need to worry about. "What complications?" Victoria asked, her tone sharper than usual. Diane realized her mistake immediately. Nothing significant, just the usual business complexities. "Mother, what complications?" I watched the exchange silently, eating my food as if merely a bystander. Diane backtracked clumsily, but the damage was done. Victoria's suspicion, once planted, was growing roots. "Are there financial issues I should know about?" Victoria pressed. "Of course not. How dare you question my judgment after everything I've done for you?" Diane's defensiveness only made things worse. She stood abruptly, knocking her wine glass over. Red liquid spread across the white tablecloth like blood. "I need air," she announced, storming onto the patio. Victoria looked at me, and for the first time in years, I saw uncertainty in her eyes. I said nothing, but I filed the moment away. The cracks were widening. I began asserting myself in small ways around the house. When Diane suggested we vacation at her timeshare in Florida, I politely declined and booked a cabin in the mountains instead. When Victoria started to object, I simply said, "I've already made the reservation. I thought a quiet getaway would be nice." They were stunned into silence. The man who'd been dismissed and ignored for 15 years was suddenly making decisions. At the grocery store, I chose brands I preferred instead of automatically reaching for Victoria's favorites. I rearranged my study without asking permission. I scheduled a dentist appointment during a time that conflicted with one of Diane's visits, forcing her to wait. These were tiny rebellions, but their cumulative effect was significant. Diane grew increasingly agitated. She wasn't used to resistance, especially from someone she considered beneath her notice. Victoria seemed confused by the shift in household dynamics. One evening, she confronted me. "Why are you being so difficult lately?" "Difficult?" I asked calmly. "I'm just making some basic decisions. Is that a problem?" She couldn't articulate why it bothered her, without admitting she'd grown comfortable with my passivity. The power balance was shifting, and they could feel it but couldn't understand it. Bernard's breakthrough came on a rainy Tuesday. He called me at school, his voice urgent but controlled. "Nathan, you need to see this." I found evidence of fraudulent bank transactions. I drove to his office immediately after my last class. The documents he showed me were damning. Diane had been creating false invoices from fictional vendors, paying them from business accounts, then routing the money to personal accounts under shell company names. This is embezzlement, Bernard said flatly. She's been stealing from her own company, probably to maintain her lifestyle while the legitimate business fails. How much? I asked. At least $800,000 over the past 3 years. Possibly more. The number staggered me. And Victoria? She signed off on some of the transfers, but it's unclear if she understood what she was authorizing. Her mother likely told her they were legitimate business expenses. I leaned back in my chair, processing this. Diane wasn't just arrogant and cruel. She was a criminal. And Victoria was either complicit or catastrophically naive. Document everything, I told Bernard. I want this airtight. My voice was steady, but inside, a cold satisfaction spread through me. The game was almost over. The first confrontation between Victoria and Diane happened without my involvement. I simply left certain documents where Victoria would find them. Specifically, bank statements showing transfers to accounts she'd never heard of. She found them while looking for tax records, exactly as I planned. The argument that erupted was volcanic. What is this account? Victoria demanded, storming into the living room where Diane was watching television. What account? Don't wave papers at me like some hysterical. This account, the one that received $200,000 from our Birmingham location last year. Diane's face went pale, then red. That's none of your concern. I was managing a business complication. By moving money to a personal account, Mother, this looks like theft. I remained in my study, doors slightly ajar, listening to everything. Diane's denials were frantic and poorly constructed. Victoria's questions grew sharper, more focused. My wife might have been complicit in her mother's schemes, but she wasn't stupid. Once her suspicion was triggered, she was relentless. I handled it. Diane finally screamed. I handled everything while you questioned nothing. You're just like your father, ungrateful and suspicious. The comparison to Victoria's late father, whom Diane had divorced bitterly, was a tactical error. Victoria went silent, which was far more dangerous than her anger. I implemented the next phase carefully. I began asking Diane direct questions at dinner. Innocent queries that forced her to explain her business decisions. How's the supplier relationship with Morrison Medical? I asked one evening. Fine, Diane snapped. Why? Just curious. I saw they filed a lawsuit against the Tennessee location. Wondered if it was resolved. Her fork clattered onto her plate. How do you know about that? It's public record. I said mildly. I was researching investments and came across it. Each question was like a needle, small but precisely placed. I asked about the Birmingham lease default, about the tax liens, about the restructuring that never seemed to restructure anything. Diane became increasingly defensive, her answers contradictory and desperate. Victoria watched these exchanges with growing alarm. Her mother, once unflappable, was unraveling, and her husband, once dismissible, was somehow driving the process with calm, devastating questions. Nathan seems very interested in business lately. Diane said to Victoria one night, loud enough for me to hear. It's suspicious. Is it? Victoria replied coolly. Maybe I should have been more interested too. The alliance between mother and daughter was fracturing. I didn't need to drive a wedge between them. I just needed to expose the truth and let it do the work. I contacted Stuart Hammond, a family lawyer whose office was downtown near Bernard's. Stuart was a man in his early 40s with a reputation for meticulous preparation and aggressive advocacy. I need to protect my assets, I told him, laying out the situation. And I need to do it in a way that's legally unquestionable. Stuart reviewed the documents Bernard had prepared, his expression growing darker with each page. Your mother-in-law has committed multiple felonies, he said finally. If this comes out, she's facing prison time, and your wife's exposure is significant. I'm not interested in destroying Victoria, I said carefully, but I won't be destroyed to protect her mother's crimes. Understood. We need to separate your assets from your wife's before the creditors start circling. I'll draft a postnuptial agreement that protects you while giving her a chance to extricate herself from her mother's mess. Over the next week, Stewart prepared an airtight legal strategy. Every step was documented, every action defensible. I wasn't just protecting myself. I was building a fortress that Diane's arrogance and Victoria's complicity couldn't penetrate. The groundwork was complete. Now I needed to choose the moment to reveal everything. Timing, I'd learned, was everything, and I was patient. Victoria found the most damning document by accident. She was searching for insurance paperwork in Diane's portfolio when she discovered the folder labeled Emergency Contingency Private. Inside were loan documents showing Diane had taken out a $2 million line of credit using Victoria and my house as collateral, without my knowledge, without my signature, using forged documents. Victoria came to my study, her face ashen, holding the papers in trembling hands. "Did you know about this?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I looked at the documents carefully, though I'd seen copies days ago. "No," I said honestly. "That's our house. Diane used our house to secure a loan." Victoria nodded, sinking into the chair across from my desk. "I didn't know. Nathan, I swear I didn't know." For the first time in 15 years, I saw my wife without her armor of superiority. She looked terrified, vulnerable, and very young. "What have I done?" she whispered. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. She was finally beginning to understand the magnitude of her mother's deception and her own complicity. "We need to talk," I said quietly. "Really talk. About everything." She nodded, tears forming in her eyes. The wife who had married me out of pity was beginning to understand she'd been the fool all along. Diane sensed the walls closing in. She became erratic, making desperate phone calls at odd hours, leaving the house for unexplained meetings, returning with the frantic energy of someone trying to outrun an avalanche. One night, she tried to remove files from her portfolio, only to find I'd already photographed everything. She didn't know that, of course, but she knew something was wrong. "Victoria," Diane cornered her daughter in the kitchen. "We need to make some financial changes. Quickly." "What kind of changes?" Victoria asked, her voice cold. "Protective measures. Moving some assets around. It's complicated, but you need to trust me. Like I trusted you with our house." Victoria's response was sharp as broken glass. Diane's face flushed. "That was a necessary business decision." "Necessary? You forged my husband's signature on loan documents." "I did what I had to do to save the business, to save our family." But Victoria was done being manipulated. "You saved nothing, Mother. You destroyed everything." I watched from the doorway as Diane's composure finally cracked completely. She was trapped, and she knew it. Her daughter had turned against her, and the son-in-law she'd mocked was somehow orchestrating her exposure. She just didn't know how complete her downfall would be. Bernard completed his final report on a Friday afternoon. It was 73 pages of detailed financial analysis, documenting every fraudulent transaction, every hidden debt, every lie Diane had constructed over the past 5 years. "This is prosecutable," Bernard said, handing me the bound document. "If you take this to the authorities, she'll be arrested." "I know," I said, "but I want something else first." That evening, I told Victoria and Diane I'd scheduled a family financial meeting for Monday morning. "We need to clarify some things," I said calmly. "I've had an accountant review our family finances, and there are issues we need to discuss." Diane's eyes went wild with panic. "You had no right. I had every right." I interrupted, my voice still calm but carrying an edge of steel. "This affects my financial future. Victoria's future. We're going to sit down, review the facts, and make some decisions about how to proceed." Victoria looked between us, finally understanding that I'd been several steps ahead this entire time. The husband she'd pitted, the man she'd dismissed, had been quietly building a case while she and her mother assumed he was too simple to understand their world. Monday morning, I repeated, 10 o'clock. Don't be late. The weekend passed in tense silence. The trap was set. Now we'd see what happened when it closed. Monday morning arrived with clear skies and sharp autumn air. I'd arranged the dining room table like a boardroom. with copies of Bernard's report at 3 places. Bernard himself sat at the head of the table, professional and impassive. Stuart Hammond sat to his left, representing my legal interests. Victoria and Diane entered the room and stopped short, seeing the setup. "What is this?" Diane demanded. "Our financial planning meeting," I said calmly. "Please sit down." They sat, Diane rigid with defensive anger, Victoria pale and uncertain. I remained standing. Bernard has completed a comprehensive review of the family business finances and our personal accounts. Bernard, would you please summarize your findings? Bernard opened his copy of the report. His voice was clinical, almost gentle, as he detailed the catastrophic truth, the failed locations, the hidden debts, the fraudulent transactions, the embezzlement. As he spoke, Diane's face went from red to white to gray. Victoria stared at the pages in front of her, tears streaming silently down her face. In summary, Bernard concluded, the business is insolvent by approximately $3.2 million. There are 7 pending lawsuits and multiple federal tax liens. Criminal fraud has occurred in the amount of at least $800,000. The silence that followed was absolute. Diane tried to speak, but no words came out at first. Finally, she managed, "This is Nathan's doing. He's manipulating these numbers to what?" I interrupted quietly. "To make you look like you embezzled $800,000? I didn't create these transactions, Diane. You did." I slid a photograph across the table. It showed one of her fraudulent invoices, signed by her, with money routed to a shell company. I didn't have to manipulate anything. I just had to look at what you never bothered to hide, because you assumed I was too stupid to understand. Victoria was reading through the report, her hands shaking. "Mother, this says you used our house as collateral without Nathan's knowledge, without his signature. That was necessary." Diane's voice rose desperately. "You don't understand the pressures I was under. So you committed fraud?" Victoria's voice broke. "You destroyed our financial security because you were under pressure?" "I was trying to save everything. I was trying to protect you. By lying to me? By forging documents? By stealing?" Stuart cleared his throat. "Mrs. Diane, I should inform you that what's documented in this report constitutes multiple felonies. Wire fraud, embezzlement, forgery. The statute of limitations hasn't expired on any of these." Diane looked at me, really looked at me, for the first time with something other than contempt. She saw fear in my eyes, she saw the trap, and she saw that I held all the cards. "Here's what's going to happen," I said, my voice steady and calm. "Bernard's report will be filed with the appropriate authorities unless certain conditions are met." I pulled out a document Stuart had prepared. First, Diane will resign from all positions in the family business effective immediately. Second, she will repay the embezzled funds, $800,000, within 90 days. If she can't, she'll sign over her personal assets toward the debt. Third, she will have no further contact with Victoria or me except through attorneys. Diane gasped, "You can't?" "I can, and I am." I turned to Victoria. "As for us, you have a choice. Stuart has prepared post-nuptial agreement papers that separate my assets from the business debts. You can sign them, and we can work on rebuilding our marriage with honesty. Or you can refuse, and I'll file for divorce to protect myself. Either way, I'm not going down with your mother's sinking ship." Victoria stared at me. This man she thought she knew. This man she'd married out of pity. "I never knew you could be this. Strong." I offered. "Capable? Smart? That's because you never bothered to look." Diane tried one more time. "Victoria, don't let him threaten you like this." "Threaten me?" Victoria's laugh was bitter. "He's the only one telling me the truth. You're the one who's been threatening everything I have." Diane's collapse was total and devastating. She tried to deflect blame to accountants, to business partners, to economic conditions beyond her control. But every excuse fell flat against Bernard's documented evidence. "You stole from your own company," Victoria said, her voice hollow. "You forged my husband's signature. You risked our home. And you called him pathetic?" Diane reached for her daughter's hand. but Victoria pulled away. "I did everything for you," Diane whispered. "No," Victoria said firmly. "You did everything for yourself. You just convinced me it was for my benefit." Stewart presented the formal documents. Diane had 72 hours to agree to the terms or face criminal prosecution. The $800,000 had to be repaid, or her condo in Scottsdale, her Mercedes, her investment accounts. Everything would be liquidated. "You can't do this to me," Diane said, looking at me with pure hatred. "I already did," I replied. "You built this trap yourself, Diane. I just made sure you walked into it." She stood abruptly, knocking her chair backward. For a moment, I thought she might attack me physically. Instead, she grabbed her purse and stormed toward the door. "This isn't over," she spat. "Yes," I said quietly. "It is." After Diane left, Victoria and I sat in silence for a long time. Bernard and Stewart had departed discreetly, leaving us alone with the wreckage of 15 years of lies. "I married you out of pity," Victoria said finally, her voice barely audible. "I know. I was so wrong." She looked at me, really looked at me. "You're the strongest person I know, and I never saw it. Because I didn't need to prove it," I said. "I knew who I was. You're the one who needed to believe I was weak, so you could feel superior." She flinched at the truth of it. "Can you forgive me?" "I don't know yet," I answered honestly. "But I'm willing to try if you are. With real honesty this time. No more secrets, no more superiority, no more Diane controlling our lives." Victoria nodded, tears flowing freely now. "I'll sign the postnuptial agreement. I'll separate myself from Mother's mess. And Nathan, I'll spend the rest of my life proving I can be the partner you deserved all along." I didn't respond immediately. Words were easy. I'd need to see actions. But for the first time in 15 years, I had hoped that the woman I'd married might actually become the wife I'd always wanted. The power dynamic had shifted completely, and it was shift Victoria had finally earned my respect by admitting she'd never deserved it in the first place. The following weeks brought swift changes. Victoria signed the postnuptial agreement, legally separating our assets from the business disaster. Diane, faced with prosecution, liquidated her personal assets to begin repaying the embezzled funds. She moved to Arizona, defeated and humiliated, cut off from the daughter she tried to control. Victoria and I began marriage counseling, working through 15 years of resentment and rebuilding on a foundation of honesty. She apologized repeatedly, painfully, for every dismissal, every condescending comment, every moment she'd made me feel small. "I thought I was better than you," she admitted in one session. "My mother convinced me that marrying you was charitable. I believed her because it made me feel important." "And now," our therapist asked, "now I understand that Nathan was always a strong one. He just had the grace not to rub in my face." At home, Victoria took genuine interest in my work for the first time. She asked about my students, attended a school fundraiser, and listened when I talked about teaching strategies. The woman who'd once found my career beneath discussion now valued it. I restructured our household finances with my name on everything. I made the major decisions. Victoria accepted this not with resentment, but with relief. She'd been drowning under her mother's expectations. Now finally she could breathe. The final twist came 6 months later. Diane, desperate to avoid prison and unable to repay all the embezzled money, attempted one last manipulation. She contacted Victoria, claiming she had evidence that I'd somehow stolen business funds myself, that I'd orchestrated the whole collapse to frame her. It was a pathetic, transparent lie, but it was her last weapon. Victoria forwarded me the email immediately. I read it calmly, then called Stewart. "She's attempting witness intimidation now," Stewart said. "This actually strengthens our case." But I had anticipated something like this. In his final review, Bernard had found one piece of evidence I'd kept in reserve. A recorded conversation from 2 years ago where Diane explicitly discussed hiding money from tax authorities, recorded inadvertently on Victoria's phone during a business dinner. I'd saved it, waiting for exactly this moment. We submitted it to the district attorney. Diane was arrested a week later, charged with tax evasion in addition to the fraud charges. Her attempt to implicate me collapsed under the weight of evidence that proved her guilt beyond any doubt. Victoria visited me at school on the day of Diane's arrest. "It's really over now, isn't she?" "Yes," I said. "It's over." She took my hand. "Thank you for not giving up on us, even when I didn't deserve it." I looked at this woman who'd married me out of pity, who'd learned the hardest way possible that strength isn't always loud, that intelligence isn't always obvious, and that the man you underestimate might be the one who saves you from yourself. "You're welcome," I said, and I meant it. The game was won. Justice was served. And somehow, impossibly, our marriage had survived, stronger for having been broken and rebuilt on truth. Sweet justice, indeed.